The morning mist clung to the North Sea like a shroud. It was June 8th, 793 AD, and the monks of Lindisfarne had already begun their prayers when the first sail appeared on the horizon. Then, another, and another, long ships with dragon heads carved into their prows, cutting through the gray waters like knives through flesh. The brothers didn't run. They didn't understand what was coming. They'd spent their entire lives on this holy island off the coast of Northumbria, copying manuscripts, tending gardens, singing psalms to a god they believed would protect them. By sunset, the beach would be red. The monastery would be ash. And the survivors would wish they'd died in the first wave of violence. Because what the Vikings did to captured monks wasn't execution. It was something far more calculated, far more cruel. Something designed to send a message that would echo across Christendom for centuries. Today, we're stepping into one of history's darkest chapters, where faith met fury, where piety met paganism, and where mercy was a word that had no translation in Old Norse. Before we begin this descent, subscribe so you don't miss our next journey into the shadows of the past. Now, let's return to that beach, to that moment when the world changed forever. The Vikings didn't just appear out of nowhere. They'd been watching. For years, Norse traders had sailed past these coastal monasteries, noting the stone buildings, the lack of walls, the absence of soldiers. They saw wealth displayed openly. Gold crosses catching the sunlight. Silver chalices used in daily rituals. Illuminated manuscripts more valuable than a warrior's weight in amber. And they saw something else. They saw men who'd taken vows never to raise weapons, who'd promised to turn the other cheek, who believed their God would deliver them from evil. To the Vikings, these weren't holy men. They were sheep waiting for slaughter, treasure waiting to be claimed. But let's be clear about who these Vikings were, because Hollywood has given us a distorted picture. These weren't the organized armies of later centuries, the great heathen army that would conquer half of England. These were raiders, opportunists, younger sons with no inheritance, adventurers seeking glory and gold. They came from Norway mostly, from fjords where farmland was scarce and winters were brutal. They worshipped gods who demanded sacrifice, who valued strength above compassion, who promised paradise only to those who died with weapons in their hands. Their heaven, Valhalla, had no place for the weak. Their religion had no concept of turning the other cheek. And when they looked at Christian monks, they saw everything their culture despised. Men who chose prayer over fighting, poverty over plunder, celibacy over the natural order of life. The monks represented a foreign god, a foreign way of thinking, a challenge to everything the Vikings believed made a man worthy of respect. This wasn't just about gold. It was about proving that the Christian God was weak, that the monks who served him were fools, that power belonged to those willing to take it with blood and steel. Lindisfarne wasn't fortified because it didn't need to be. For 200 years, the monastery had stood as a beacon of learning and faith. It was founded by Saint Aidan in 635 AD, and in the century and a half that followed, it had become one of the most important religious centers in Britain. The Lindisfarne Gospels, one of the most beautiful, illuminated manuscripts ever created, was produced here around 715 AD. Monks from across Europe came to study, to pray, to copy texts that preserved knowledge from the ancient world. The island was considered so sacred that even local warlords respected its neutrality. The monks had grown comfortable, perhaps complacent. They kept their treasures in plain sight. They rang bells to mark the hours, bells that could be heard for miles across the water. They established a routine so predictable you could set a sundial by it. And on that June morning in 793, they were following that routine exactly when the dragon ships beached on the northern shore. The first monks to see the Vikings probably felt confusion before fear. Ships arrived occasionally, traders, pilgrims, visitors sent by other monasteries. But these men coming up the beach weren't dressed like traders. They wore leather and wool, carried round shields painted with ravens and wolves, wielded axes and swords that caught the pale morning light, and they were running. Not walking, running, war cries tearing from their throats. sounds that didn't belong in a place of prayer. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, written by monks who survived other raids, recorded what happened next in words so stark they still carry weight 12 centuries later. Never before has such terror appeared in Britain as we have now suffered from a pagan race. The heathens poured out the blood of saints around the altar, and trampled on the bodies of saints in the temple of God, like dung in the streets. But even these words, written by men trained in rhetoric, men who understood the power of language, couldn't fully capture what happened in those first minutes. Because the Vikings didn't just kill, they desecrated. They destroyed. They performed violence like a ritual, turning the sacred spaces of Christianity into stages for demonstrating the superiority of their gods. The first monks died quickly, cut down as they tried to flee, or as they knelt in prayer, believing their God would intervene. But the Vikings learned fast that quick deaths didn't serve their purpose. They needed the survivors to watch. They needed the terror to spread. They needed every monastery along every coast to hear what happened at Lindisfarne and understand that the old protections no longer applied. So they began to get creative. They began to show what happened when men of peace met men of war. They began to demonstrate what Vikings did to those who couldn't fight back. The abbot, the leader of the monastery, was dragged to the altar. In Christian tradition, the altar is the holiest place in a church, the spot where bread and wine become the body and blood of Christ, where heaven touches earth. The Vikings understood this. They'd raided enough churches to know what these spaces meant, and that's exactly why they chose to do what they did next on that altar. They stripped the abbot naked, removing the vestments that marked his holy office, reducing him from a representative of God to just another frightened old man. Then they bent him over the altar face down, and they took turns, not killing him. That would have been mercy. They raped him. In front of the other monks, on the holiest spot in the monastery, while the Christian cross looked down from the wall. This wasn't about lust. Vikings had wives, had concubines, had access to women. This was about power, about humiliation, about destroying not just a man but everything he represented, about proving that the Christian God either couldn't or wouldn't protect his servants, about turning a holy space into a crime scene. When they finished, when the abbot was broken and bleeding on the stone that had blessed communion wine hours before, they did something worse. They made the other monks clean him, made them lift their spiritual father from the altar, made them witness the complete destruction of his dignity, made them understand that everything they believed about sanctuary, about divine protection, about the power of faith, was a lie that bled and cried and begged for death. But the Vikings weren't done with the abbot. Death would have been a release, and they weren't interested in release. They were interested in sending messages. So they introduced the monks of Lindisfarne to a punishment that would become synonymous with Viking cruelty, a ritual execution so brutal that even hardened warriors across Europe would speak of it in whispers. They called it the Blood Eagle. Modern historians debate whether the Blood Eagle was real or whether it was a mistranslation of Old Norse poetry, whether it was a genuine execution method, or whether it was metaphorical language that later generations took literally. But the sources are clear. The sagas mention it. The Anglo-Saxon chronicles reference it. And the archaeological evidence, when we find it, tells a story of precision violence that went far beyond simple murder. The Blood Eagle wasn't done in rage. It was done with purpose. Here's what it involved. The victim was placed face down, stripped naked, arms spread. A Viking with a sharp axe would make 2 cuts along either side of the spine, from the neck down to the lower back. Then, with practiced hands, they would pry the ribs away from the spine, breaking them carefully so they splayed outward like wings, like eagle wings. The victim was still alive. That was the point. They had to be alive. Because the final step was pulling the lungs out through the opening, draping them over the broken ribs so they rose and fell with each agonized breath. The victim would live for minutes, maybe longer, breathing through lungs exposed to open air, feeling every sensation as their body shut down. The Vikings believed this was the only execution worthy of a king or a worthy enemy. It was an honor, in their twisted logic, and they gave it to the abbot of Lindisfarne. Whether they performed the full-blood eagle, or whether they simply carved his back open and told the other monks they had, the message was clear. Your God won't save you. Your prayers mean nothing. Your sanctuary is a joke. And when we're done, you'll wish we'd just killed you quickly. The other monks watched. They had to. The Vikings made sure of it. Some were held by their hair, heads wrenched toward the spectacle. Others were beaten when they tried to close their eyes or look away. A few fainted and were revived with cold water from the holy font, water blessed for baptisms, now used to wake men so they could watch their abbot die. And while this was happening, while the spiritual leader of Lindisfarne was being destroyed piece by piece, other Vikings were methodically looting the monastery. But not randomly. With purpose, they took the gold and silver first, the practical treasures, crosses, candlesticks, chalices, anything that could be melted down or traded. They took the illuminated manuscripts, not because they could read Latin, but because they understood these books had value. Some would be ransomed back to other monasteries. Others would be torn apart, the gold leaf scraped from the pages, the vellum discarded or used for profane purposes. The Vikings knew enough about Christian culture to understand that destruction of holy books was its own form of violence. Assault on the faith itself as much as on the monks. They found the wine stores and drank deeply. They found the food stores and gorged themselves. They urinated in the holy water fonts. They defecated on the altar after the abbot's body was finally dragged away. Every sacred space was violated, deliberately, systematically, turning 200 years of sanctity into a single afternoon of desecration. This was psychological warfare as much as physical violence. But what about the monks who survived that first wave of killing? There were dozens of them, brothers who'd lived their entire adult lives in this monastery, who'd taken vows of poverty and chastity and obedience. What happened to them? The Vikings divided them into groups. The old were generally killed, though not always quickly. Some were used for target practice, made to run while Vikings threw axes at them, laughing when a blade found its mark, jeering when it missed. Others were simply beaten to death, clubbed until their skulls cracked, left where they fell. The Vikings had no use for old men who couldn't work, couldn't row, couldn't be sold. They were waste, and waste was eliminated. The young and strong faced a different fate. They were valuable, not as people, but as commodities. The Viking slave trade was extensive and sophisticated. Thralls, as they called slaves, were a cornerstone of Norse society. Every jarl needed laborers. Every household needed servants, and there was always a market. In Dublin, in the Orkney Islands, in Scandinavia itself, for healthy young men who could work until they dropped, but before these monks could be sold, they had to be broken. Not physically broken, that would reduce their value. Mentally broken, spiritually broken. Broken in ways that would make them compliant, obedient, defeated. So the Vikings developed methods. They started with the hair. Monks had distinctive tonsures, the top of their heads shaved in a circle to symbolize the crown of thorns Christ wore at his crucifixion. The Vikings shaved the rest of their heads, removing the tonsure, erasing the visible mark of their holy office. Then they burned the crowns of their heads with hot coals, scarring them, marking them as former monks who'd been conquered. This wasn't just cruelty. It was rebranding, literally marking the flesh to show these men no longer belonged to their God. They forced the monks to renounce their vows. Not because the Vikings cared about Christian theology, but because they understood that breaking oaths, even oaths made to a foreign god, damaged men psychologically. They'd make monks repeat after them, in broken Latin, words renouncing Christ, pledging allegiance to Odin, cursing the Christian God. Most monks refused at first. So the Vikings provided incentives. They'd take one monk, strip him naked, and stake him out on the beach at low tide. Then, they'd wait. As the tide came in, slowly, inevitably, the monk would feel the cold water rising, first around his feet, then his legs, then his torso. The instinct to survive would war with the commitment to faith. Most men, when the water reached their faces, when they were about to drown, would do anything to live. They'd scream the words, any words, whatever the Vikings wanted. And then, when they'd broken, when they'd renounced their God to save their lives, the Vikings would pull them up, revive them, and laugh. Because now these monks knew they were damned. They'd broken their most sacred vows. They'd chosen life over faith. They'd proven, to themselves and to everyone watching, that their God wasn't worth dying for. This broke men more completely than any torture. Because the Vikings didn't just destroy their bodies. They destroyed their certainty, their foundation, their reason for living. After that, most stopped resisting. They accepted the iron collars riveted around their necks. They shuffled onto the ships in chains. They took their places at the oars. And when the dragon ships left Lindisfarne, heading north with holds full of treasure and decks full of broken men, the island was silent except for the crying of the gulls and the crackling of flames consuming the monastery. But some monks weren't taken as slaves. Some were kept for entertainment, because the Vikings had long voyages ahead of them, and entertainment was valuable. And nothing entertained Viking warriors quite like watching holy men suffer. They had a game they called Thread the Needle. They'd force a monk to run between two lines of Vikings, each warrior holding a weapon. Sword, axe, spear. The monk would run, and the Vikings would strike at him. But not to kill. They'd cut him, stab him, wound him, but deliberately miss anything vital. The goal was to see how many times they could hit the monk before he collapsed. Whoever landed the final blow that dropped him won the pot. Whatever the men had wagered. Sometimes, the monk survived. More often, he bled out on the deck, while the Vikings divided up his torn robes as trophies. Another favorite was Christ walking. They'd tie a monk's hands behind his back and throw him overboard. Then, they'd row alongside him, slowly, watching him struggle to keep his head above water. They'd shout, "Walk on water! Your God did it! Show us!" When the monk finally went under, exhausted, drowning, they'd pull him up at the last second, revive him, and throw him back in, over and over, until his lungs filled with seawater and his body gave up. They called it entertainment. They called it testing the Christian God. But really, it was torture dressed up as theology. And the worst part? The other captive monks were forced to watch. Forced to see what awaited them if they displeased their captors. Forced to understand that their suffering could always get worse. Let's talk about what happened to the monks who were sold as slaves, because their story doesn't end with the raid. It continues for years, sometimes decades, in a life so far removed from the monastery that it might as well have been a different world. When the ships reached Scandinavian ports, the monks were paraded through markets like livestock. And that's what they were. Livestock. Potential buyers would examine their teeth, feel their muscles, check for scars or diseases. The Vikings would tout their training. This one can read and write Latin. This one knows mathematics. This one understands church rituals. Because educated slaves were valuable, they could keep records, teach children, serve as scribes. But there was a catch. The buyers wanted broken slaves, compliant ones. So before the sale, the Vikings would demonstrate. They'd order a monk to perform some degrading task, bow down to an idol of Thor, kiss a Viking's boots, renounce his god publicly. If the monk obeyed instantly, his price went up. He'd been properly trained. If he hesitated, the Vikings would beat him right there in the market until he complied, or until he was unconscious. Either way, the lesson was clear. Obedience or suffering. There was no third option. Most of the Lindisfarne monks ended up in Norwegian households, thralls who would spend the rest of their lives in bondage. Their days began before dawn, hauling water, tending animals, working fields, doing the labor that allowed Norse society to function. They were property, with no rights, no protection under law. Their owners could beat them, work them to death, kill them on a whim. If a thrall ran away and was caught, the punishment was immediate and public. They'd cut off the thrall's feet at the ankles, then cauterize the stumps with hot iron so he wouldn't bleed out. He'd live, crippled. A warning to other slaves about the price of seeking freedom. He'd have to drag himself around on his knees for whatever years remained to him. Living proof that escape was worse than submission. Some monks tried to keep their faith alive in secret. They'd whisper prayers when their masters weren't listening. They'd scratch crosses into the dirt and then erase them quickly. They'd try to remember the psalms, the liturgies, the rituals that had structured their days back at Lindisfarne. But it was hard. Memory fades when there's no community to reinforce it. Faith weakens when prayer never seems answered. And, after years of slavery, after seasons of backbreaking work and casual cruelty, many of the monks simply forgot who they'd been. They took Norse names, they stopped praying. They accepted that the Christian God had abandoned them, or that he'd never had any power to begin with. They became what their captors had always said they were, just men, ordinary and powerless, whose prayers were empty words and whose God was a comforting lie. And maybe that was the cruelest thing the Vikings did. Not the violence during the raid, not the blood eagle or the drownings or the rapes, but the slow erosion of faith, the grinding away of identity over years until the monks of Lindisfarne, men who dedicated their lives to God, died as Viking slaves who no longer remembered why they'd ever thought prayer mattered. A few, a very few, managed to escape. There are records of Christian thralls making their way back to England or Ireland, sometimes decades after their capture, but they were broken men, scarred physically and mentally. They'd seen things, done things, survived things that no holy life could have prepared them for. Most ended their days in monasteries, taken in out of charity, but never fully recovering. They'd wake screaming from nightmares. They'd flinch at loud noises. They'd have episodes where they couldn't remember where they were, whether they were monks again or still slaves. We'd call it PTSD today. Back then, they called it being touched by demons, and they prayed for these men's souls as much as for their bodies. Now let's talk about what happened back at Lindisfarne after the Vikings left. Because the raid didn't just affect the people who were there. It sent shockwaves through Christian Europe that would reshape the political and religious landscape for centuries. When word reached the court of Charlemagne, the most powerful Christian ruler in Europe, he was horrified. Not just by the violence, which was common enough in his world, but by what it represented. The Vikings had struck at a holy site, killed priests, destroyed a monastery. This wasn't war between Christian kingdoms. This was pagans attacking Christendom itself. Alcuin of York, one of the greatest scholars of the age, and a former teacher at Lindisfarne, wrote a series of letters that captured the theological crisis the raid created. He asked questions that must have kept every monk in Europe awake at night. Why would God allow pagans to destroy his holy places? Why didn't he protect the monks who dedicated their lives to his service? Was this a punishment for some collective sin? Were the monks at Lindisfarne somehow unworthy? Or was it proof that the old gods, the pagan gods, were stronger? These weren't abstract theological questions. They were existential crises for a civilization built on the belief that the Christian God protected those who served him faithfully. And Lindisfarne proved that wasn't true. Or at least, it proved that protection came with no guarantees. Faith didn't save you from violence. Holiness didn't grant immunity from suffering. And the pagans, who prayed to gods of thunder and war, seemed to be winning. This led to a wave of fortress building across Christian Europe. Monasteries that had stood undefended for centuries suddenly sprouted walls. Watchtowers went up along coastlines. Alarm systems were developed, chains of beacons that could be lit to warn of approaching ships. The church militant was born, not as a metaphor but as a practical necessity. Monks started training with weapons. Some monasteries hired mercenaries. The age of assuming God would provide ended on that beach at Lindisfarne. From then on, Christians would trust in God but also in 6 feet of stone wall and a garrison of soldiers. But the psychological impact went deeper. For the Vikings, the Lindisfarne raid was proof of concept. They'd hit a target everyone assumed was untouchable, and they'd gotten away with it. They'd filled their ships with treasure, taken slaves, and sailed home without losing a single man. And the Christian God had done nothing. In Viking halls that winter, skalds composed poems about the raid. They sang of brave warriors who'd struck at the foreign god's house and emerged victorious. Young men who'd never been on a raid listened to these stories and dreamed of their own adventures. And the next summer, more ships came. More monasteries burned. More monks died or were enslaved. The raid on Lindisfarne wasn't a one-time event. It was the beginning of 2 centuries of Viking expansion, of raids and conquests that would reshape Europe. And it all started because a group of warriors discovered that the richest, most vulnerable targets in Britain were the places Christians considered too holy to attack. For the monks who survived, the ones who hadn't been killed or enslaved, who'd hidden or escaped, the psychological toll was immeasurable. Imagine dedicating your entire life to prayer, to scholarship, to serving God. Imagine believing that your monastery was a sanctuary, that holiness provided protection, and then imagine watching everything you believed be proven false in a single afternoon of blood and fire. Some monks left the religious life entirely. They couldn't reconcile what had happened with what they'd been taught about God's providence. If God allowed Lindisfarne to fall, if he let his faithful servants be tortured and enslaved, then what was the point of faith? Others doubled down, becoming more devout, more ascetic, interpreting the raid as a test or a punishment that required greater devotion. But they never felt safe again. Every sail on the horizon brought panic. Every stranger was a potential threat. They'd learned that the world was more dangerous than their theology had prepared them for. The Vikings kept raiding for decades. In 794, the year after Lindisfarne, they hit the monasteries at Jarrow and Wearmouth. In 795, they raided Iona in Scotland, one of the holiest sites in Celtic Christianity. In 798, they sacked St. Patrick's Island off the coast of Ireland. The pattern was the same: arrive without warning, overwhelm any resistance, kill or capture the monks, loot everything of value, burn what remains, and leave before any military response could arrive. And each time, they refined their techniques. They learned which monasteries had the most treasures. They learned the best times to attack, usually early morning or during religious festivals when the monks were gathered for prayer. They learned how to terrify survivors into compliance with minimum effort. A few examples of extreme violence at the start of a raid: a blood eagle here, a mass drowning there, and the remaining monks would surrender without resistance. It was psychological warfare perfected through practice. Some monasteries tried to fight back. The monks at Bangor in Ireland reportedly armed themselves and attempted to defend their monastery when the Vikings came in 824. It didn't work. The Vikings were professional warriors who'd been training with weapons since childhood. The monks were scholars and priests who'd picked up swords a few weeks earlier. The Battle of Bangor, if you can call it that, lasted less than an hour. Over 900 monks died. The survivors were enslaved. And the Vikings added another story to their collection, another warning to other monasteries about the futility of resistance. But here's what's important to understand. The Vikings weren't mindless barbarians. They were rational actors operating within their own cultural framework. In Norse society, wealth was meant to be taken, not protected by walls or laws. The gods favored the strong, the brave, those willing to risk death for glory and gold. Mercy was weakness. Compassion was foolishness. The Christian virtues, meekness, humility, turning the other cheek, were seen as signs of degeneracy, proof that Christianity made men soft and unfit to survive in a harsh world. So, when Vikings performed the blood eagle on a captured monk, when they drowned priests while mocking their god, when they raped holy men on altars, they weren't being needlessly cruel by their own standards. They were demonstrating the superiority of their worldview. They were proving that their gods, who demanded strength, were more powerful than the Christian God who preached weakness. They were sending a message not just to the monks, but to Christendom itself. Your way of life is a lie. Your God can't protect you. Strength defeats piety, always. And for a while, they were right. For 2 centuries, from 793 until the Christianization of Scandinavia in the late 900s and early 1000s, the Vikings dominated northern Europe. They conquered half of England, establishing the Danelaw. They settled Iceland, Greenland, and briefly North America. They founded the Kievan Rus, which would eventually become Russia. They served as elite guards for the Byzantine emperors. They were everywhere, and everywhere they went, they brought their values: strength, cunning, the willingness to do whatever it took to win. But history has a long arc. Slowly, Christianity began to push back. Not through military victories, though those came eventually, but through conversion. Viking warriors who married Christian women saw their children raised Christian. Norse traders who dealt with Christian merchants saw the advantages of a religion that encouraged honesty in business dealings, that provided a shared moral framework across cultures. Young Vikings who'd been taken as hostages by Christian kings were educated by monks, the same monks their fathers had once raided. And gradually, over generations, Scandinavia converted. By the year 1000, most of Norway was officially Christian. Denmark followed. Sweden took longer, but eventually it too abandoned the old gods. And when that happened, when the Vikings became Christians themselves, they looked back at what their ancestors had done to monks like those at Lindisfarne, and they were horrified. The sagas written down in Christian Iceland in the 1200s treat the early raids with ambivalence, celebrating the bravery of the warriors, but condemning the attacks on churches as shameful. The blood eagle, once sung about in halls, became a dark secret, something whispered about but rarely discussed openly. The slave trade in Christian captives ended, replaced by laws that made enslaving fellow Christians illegal. But by then, the damage was done. Thousands of monks had died. Hundreds of monasteries had been destroyed. Entire libraries of illuminated manuscripts, containing knowledge from the ancient world that existed nowhere else, had been burned or torn apart for their gold leaf. The trauma inflicted on Christian communities in Britain, Ireland, and France would shape their cultures for centuries. The English developed a particular paranoia about seaborne invasions that persists to some degree even today. The Irish Church never fully recovered its early medieval prominence, and the monks who survived, who'd been enslaved or who'd witnessed the raids, carried that trauma for the rest of their lives. There's a prayer that started appearing in churches across Northern Europe in the 800s, a new addition to the liturgy that previous generations had never needed. From the fury of the Northmen, O Lord, deliver us. Think about that. An entire civilization so traumatized by Viking raids that they added a specific plea for divine protection to their regular worship. And the monks who whispered that prayer, who begged God to save them from the Northmen, knew exactly what they were asking to be spared from. They knew about Lindisfarne. They knew about the blood eagle. They knew about the drownings, the rapes, the slavery. They knew that if the dragon ships appeared on their horizon, their prayers might not be enough. They knew that faith couldn't stop an axe. They knew that holiness didn't prevent suffering. But they prayed anyway. Because what else could they do? They were monks. Prayer was their weapon, their shield, their only defense against a world that had proven itself far more brutal than their theology had prepared them for. And they prayed knowing that at Lindisfarne, prayer hadn't been enough. Knowing that the abbot had died, screaming on the altar. Knowing that brothers had been dragged into slavery. Knowing that the sacred flame that had burned for 2 centuries had been extinguished by pagans who laughed while they desecrated everything holy. They prayed anyway, because the alternative was to admit that the Vikings had won, that strength defeated piety, that the old gods of blood and thunder were more real than the Christian God of love and mercy, and they couldn't admit that. So they prayed, and they built walls, and they trained with weapons, and they tried to reconcile a faith built on peace with a world that only understood violence. The The story of what Vikings did to Christian monks is ultimately a story about what happens when two completely incompatible worldviews collide. On one side, men who believed that suffering brought them closer to God, that sacrifice was holy, that the meek would inherit the earth. On the other, men who believed that strength was virtue, that victory proved divine favor, that the only inheritance worth having was the one you could take by force. When these worldviews met on the beach at Lindisfarne, only one could be validated. And in that moment, in that afternoon of blood and fire, it was the Viking worldview that prevailed. The monks' God didn't save them. Their prayers didn't protect them. Their holiness didn't grant them immunity. They suffered. They died. They were enslaved. And the Vikings sailed home rich and victorious, their gods seemingly proven superior. But here's the thing about worldviews. They don't compete on level ground. The Viking way of life required constant expansion, constant raiding, constant warfare to sustain itself. It was glorious, but it wasn't sustainable. The Christian way of life, for all its vulnerability to violence, created stable societies, accumulated knowledge, built institutions that lasted centuries. The Vikings won every battle, but over the long term, Christianity won the war, not through military conquest, but through cultural assimilation, through the slow, grinding power of ideas, through the simple fact that societies built on cooperation and shared moral frameworks tend to outlast societies built on individual glory and the cult of the warrior. By the year 1100, Viking culture, as it had existed in 793, was essentially gone. Absorbed into Christian Europe, remembered in sagas, but no longer practiced. The monasteries rebuilt, new monks took vows. The libraries were restocked, slowly, painstakingly. And Lindisfarne, that island where it all began, became a pilgrimage site, a place where Christians came to remember the martyrs who died there. Today, you can visit the ruins. The monastery was destroyed again during the Reformation, so what stands now is already a ruin of a ruin. But you can still walk the beach where the dragon ships landed. You can still see the stones that once formed the altar where the abbot died. You can still feel the wind coming off the North Sea, the same wind that filled Viking sails 12 centuries ago. And if you stand there quietly, if you let yourself imagine what happened on that June morning in 793, you might understand why this story matters. Not because it's shocking, though it is. Not because it's violent, though it certainly is that. But because it's a reminder that faith, no matter how deeply held, doesn't grant immunity from suffering. That holiness doesn't prevent violence. That sometimes the wicked prosper and the righteous suffer. And there's no divine intervention to set things right. The monks of Lindisfarne believed God would protect them. They were wrong. They believed their vows mattered, that their holy orders provided sanctuary, that the altar was inviolable. They were wrong about all of it. And they paid for those beliefs with their blood, their freedom, their lives. But here's the complicated part. They were also right. Not about the immediate protection, obviously. God didn't send angels to drive the Vikings back into the sea. The altar didn't become an impenetrable shield. Prayer didn't stop axes. But they were right that their work mattered. The manuscripts they'd copied preserved knowledge that would have otherwise been lost. The Christianity they'd spread created a framework for European civilization that lasted 1,000 years. The example they set, of men willing to die for their beliefs rather than abandon them, inspired generations of Christians who came after. The Vikings who killed them are remembered as brutal raiders. The monks who died are remembered as martyrs. History is longer than any individual life, and sometimes losing in the moment means winning in the end. But that's cold comfort when you're the one being dragged to the altar. That's abstract philosophy when you're the one being thrown into the sea while your captors mock your God. That's meaningless when you're the one being sold in a slave market, branded and broken and hopeless. The monks of Lindisfarne didn't know they'd be remembered. They didn't know their martyrdom would mean something. In the moment, all they knew was terror, pain, the betrayal of everything they'd believed. And that's the truth we have to sit with. That faith doesn't always save you. That righteousness doesn't prevent suffering. That sometimes the bad guys win and the good guys die screaming, and there's no cosmic justice to balance the scales. So, what do we do with this story? How do we process what the Vikings did to captured monks? We could frame it as a clash of civilizations, which it was. We could see it as a critique of pacifism, evidence that turning the other cheek doesn't work when the other side is willing to cut your throat. We could treat it as historical curiosity, a dark chapter from a more brutal age that has nothing to teach us today. Or we could recognize it for what it really is, a story about what happens when power meets vulnerability, about what human beings are capable of when they strip away moral constraints and embrace violence as virtue, about the price paid by those who choose peace in a world that rewards aggression. The Vikings weren't monsters. They were people operating within a cultural framework that valued different things than we do, different things than the monks did. They thought they were right. They thought they were strong, and the monks were weak. They thought their actions proved the superiority of their gods and the folly of Christian mercy. And in the immediate term, they were validated. They got rich. They got glory. They got everything their culture told them to pursue. But culture changes. Values shift. And eventually, the descendants of those Viking raiders became Christians themselves, built churches on the sites of the monasteries their grandfathers had burned, and prayed to the same God, whose servants they'd once tortured and enslaved. History is full of bitter ironies like that. The Vikings won the battle at Lindisfarne, Christianity won the long game, and the monks who died, who suffered, who were enslaved and broken and destroyed, they're remembered now, 1,200 years later. In a way, the individual Vikings who killed them are not. We don't know the names of the raiders who beached their ships that June morning. We don't remember which warrior performed the blood eagle, or who raped the abbot, or who drowned monks while mocking their prayers. Those men are anonymous, lost to history, their individual identities erased by time. But we remember Lindisfarne. We remember what happened there. We remember that monks died for their faith, that they suffered, and that their suffering meant something, even if they never lived to see it. And maybe that's the only justice available in a universe that doesn't always reward virtue or punish vice. The justice of memory. The justice of history. The justice of knowing that cruelty is remembered as cruelty, that brutality is remembered as brutality, and that the victims, even when they lose everything, even when they die in agony, are remembered as victims, not as fools or weaklings, but as people who stood for something and paid the price. The monks of Lindisfarne couldn't fight back. Their vows forbade it. Their training prevented it. Their faith demanded that they trust God even when God seemed absent, and they died for it. They suffered for it. Some of them broke under the pressure and renounced everything they believed. Others held firm and paid an even higher price. But all of them, whether they kept their faith or lost it, whether they died quickly or suffered for years as slaves, all of them faced an impossible choice between their beliefs and their survival. And the fact that many of them chose their beliefs, even knowing the cost, says something about human courage that no amount of cynicism can erase. So yes, what the Vikings did to captured Christian monks was worse than death. It was death plus humiliation. Death plus desecration. Death plus the destruction of everything that gave their lives meaning. It was calculated cruelty, designed to break not just bodies but souls, to prove that faith was worthless, and mercy was weakness, and holiness was a lie. And it worked, on the individual level. The monks suffered, the monasteries burned. The Christian God, if he was watching, didn't intervene. But on the broader level, it failed. Because we're still talking about it. Still remembering. Still understanding that what happened at Lindisfarne was an atrocity, that the monks didn't deserve their fate, that suffering unjustly doesn't make you weak. It makes you a victim, and being a victim doesn't erase your humanity or the value of what you stood for. The Vikings thought they were proving their strength. What they actually proved was their capacity for cruelty, and history has judged them for it, even as it also acknowledges their achievements, their artistry, their exploration, their eventual integration into the Christian world they once terrorized. It's complicated. History usually is. But some things are simple. What happened to the monks at Lindisfarne was wrong. What the Vikings did to captured priests was monstrous. And the fact that it happened, the fact that human beings were capable of such calculated cruelty to other human beings who'd never harmed them, who'd taken vows of peace, who represented everything opposite to violence, that's something we need to remember. Not to hate the Vikings. Most of them are 1,000 years in the grave, and hating the dead is pointless. But to understand what we're capable of, what all of us are capable of, given the right circumstances, the right cultural framework, the right incentives. The Vikings weren't uniquely evil. They were people who believed they were right, who acted according to their values, who did things that seemed justified within their worldview. And that's the terrifying part. Because if they could commit atrocities while believing they were righteous, what does that say about our own certainties? What does that say about the things we do, the systems we support, the violence we enable while believing we're on the right side? These are uncomfortable questions. But they're the questions that stories like Lindisfarne force us to ask. Not just, how could the Vikings do this? But what are we doing that future generations will look back on with the same horror? What are our equivalents of the blood eagle? The cruelties we've normalized, the suffering we've justified, the victims we've dismissed because they don't fit into our understanding of who deserves compassion? Tell us what you think. Does faith make people vulnerable? Should the monks have armed themselves? Were the Vikings just products of their culture? Or does that not excuse what they did? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. And if this deep dive into one of history's darkest chapters affected you, if you felt the weight of what those monks endured, subscribe to our channel. We're bringing light to the darkest corners of history, one story at a time. Because these stories matter. These lives mattered. And the lessons they teach, about courage and cruelty, about faith and violence, about what happens when worldviews collide, those lessons are worth remembering. Until next time, remember that history isn't just dates and battles and famous names. It's people. People who suffered, who hoped, who believed, who died. People like the monks of Lindisfarne, who woke up on an ordinary morning in June and by sunset had lost everything. Their story deserves to be told, and now you know it. Not the sanitized version, not the glossed-over summary from a textbook, but the full horror of what happened when Vikings did to Christian monks something worse than death. Remember them, remember what they endured, and remember that the capacity for both extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary courage exists in all of us, waiting to be called forth by circumstance, by culture, by the choices we make when we're tested. The monks of Lindisfarne were tested. Some failed, some succeeded, but all of them faced a trial that no amount of prayer or study had prepared them for. And their suffering echoes across 12 centuries. A reminder that faith doesn't grant immunity, that holiness doesn't prevent horror, but that somehow, even in the darkest moments, even when God seems absent and evil prevails, the human spirit can find meaning in suffering, purpose in martyrdom, and dignity even in defeat.